His neighbor's drone captured something shocking: the HOA president illegally dumping trash. But when he tried to expose the truth, the HOA fought back with everything they had. Now, this ordinary homeowner is in the fight of his life, risking it all to take down the corrupt HOA and restore justice to his community. Ethan couldn't believe his eyes. The drone footage playing on his phone was clear as day. The HOA president, Gregory Simmons, surreptitiously dumping a truckload of garbage in the nature preserve behind their neighborhood. This was the smoking gun Ethan had been waiting for, proof of the HOA's hypocrisy and corruption. For months, the HOA had been cracking down on minor violations, fining residents for the smallest infractions. They even moved to ban all drones, citing privacy concerns, right after Ethan had purchased one to monitor his property. But now Ethan knew the real reason. The HOA was desperate to hide its own misdeeds. Hands trembling with a mix of anger and excitement, Ethan rushed to his computer. He quickly edited the drone footage, overlaying timestamps and GPS coordinates to authenticate the evidence. Then he composed a scathing email detailing Simmons' illegal dumping and calling for his immediate resignation. Ethan's finger hovered over the send button. This was it, the moment of truth. If he went public with this, there was no going back. The HOA would come after him with everything they had. But the thought of Simmons and his cronies continuing to abuse their power and line their pockets was too much to bear. Ethan took a deep breath and pressed send. Within hours, the email had spread like wildfire through the community. Outraged residents flooded the HOA's social media pages, demanding action. Simmons, realizing his scheme had been exposed, went into damage control mode, dismissing the footage as doctored and accusing Ethan of harassment. The next day, Ethan received a letter from the HOA's attorney. They were suing him for invasion of privacy and defamation of character, demanding he take down the drone footage and issue a public apology. Ethan's heart sank. He had known the HOA would retaliate, but he never expected them to go this far. Determined to fight back, Ethan reached out to a local news station, hoping they would be interested in the story. But the HOA was one step ahead of him. They had already launched a smear campaign, painting Ethan as a troublemaker and the drone footage as a fabrication. The news station, wary of the legal threats, declined to cover the story. Ethan felt isolated and overwhelmed. The HOA's resources and influence were far greater than his own. But he couldn't give up, not when the truth was on his side. He would have to find another way to expose Simmons and the HOA's corruption. The stakes were too high to back down now. Sensing the tide turning against him, Ethan knew he needed to take drastic action. He decided to confront Simmons directly, hoping to appeal to the man's conscience and convince him to come clean. One evening, Ethan waited in the shadows near the HOA president's house, heart pounding as he watched Simmons pull into the driveway. As Simmons approached his front door, Ethan stepped out from his hiding place. "Mr. Simmons, we need to talk," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the nerves churning in his stomach. Simmons spun around, his eyes widening with a mix of surprise and annoyance. "What the hell are you doing on my property, Ethan?" "I should call the police." "Please, just hear me out," Ethan pleaded. "I have evidence of you illegally dumping trash in the nature preserve. Everyone in the neighborhood knows about it now. You need to come clean and take responsibility for your actions." Simmons let out a harsh laugh. "Evidence? That footage was faked, and you know it. I'm not going to let some disgruntled homeowner ruin my reputation and my life's work with the HOA. Your life's work is nothing but a cover for your own greed and corruption." Ethan shot back, his anger rising. "You've been using your position to line your own pockets, while the rest of us suffer under your petty rules and excessive fines." Simmons' face contorted with rage. "How dare you? I've dedicated years to improving this community, and this is the thanks I get." He stepped menacingly closer to Ethan. "You've made a big mistake, my friend. The HOA won't take this lying down. We're going to bury you in lawsuits until you're begging for mercy. Ethan stood his ground, refusing to be intimidated. I'm not afraid of your threats, Simmons. The truth will come out, no matter what you do. The two men glared at each other, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Ethan knew he had pushed Simmons too far, but he couldn't back down now. This was a fight for the soul of their community, and he was determined to see it through. As Simmons turned and stormed into his house, Ethan felt a growing sense of dread. He had ignited a war with the HOA, and he wasn't sure if he had the strength to win. The next few weeks were a blur of legal maneuvering and public relations battles. The HOA had pulled out all the stops, filing multiple lawsuits against Ethan and launching a relentless smear campaign through local media. Ethan found himself overwhelmed, struggling to keep up with the endless barrage of legal documents and public statements. The HOA's attorneys were skilled and merciless, painting him as a disgruntled troublemaker with a personal vendetta against the community. Despite his best efforts, Ethan's drone footage and emails were increasingly discredited in the public eye. Neighbors who had once expressed outrage at Simmons' illegal dumping now questioned Ethan's motives and the veracity of his claims. Feeling backed into a corner, Ethan decided to take a bold step. He organized a town hall meeting, inviting the entire neighborhood to hear his side of the story. As Ethan stood before the packed room, his palms were sweaty and his heart raced. But he knew he had to speak up, even if it meant risking further retaliation from the HOA. Friends and neighbors, I know many of you have doubts about the claims I've made, Ethan began, his voice steady and resolute. But I assure you, the evidence I have against the HOA president is real and undeniable. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. Simmons and the HOA have been using their power to line their own pockets, while punishing the rest of us with petty fines and unreasonable rules. And now, they're willing to go to any lengths to cover up their misdeeds, even if it means destroying me in the process. A collective murmur rippled through the audience as Ethan displayed the drone footage once again, pointing out the timestamps and GPS coordinates that proved its authenticity. I'm not asking you to take my word for it, Ethan said, his gaze sweeping across the room. I'm asking you to look at the facts, to see the truth for yourselves. Because if we don't stand up to this corruption now, who knows what else the HOA might get away with in the future. The room erupted in applause, and Ethan felt a surge of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he had turned the tide in his favor. But as he stepped down from the podium, Ethan couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the HOA was far from finished with him. In the days following the town hall meeting, Ethan's newfound momentum seemed to stall. The HOA's legal team doubled down on their efforts, filing even more lawsuits and seeking to have Ethan's drone footage completely barred from use as evidence. Simmons, meanwhile, continued his public relations blitz, painting Ethan as an unhinged conspiracy theorist. The HOA president even went so far as to claim that Ethan had illegally obtained the drone footage through hacking or trespassing. Ethan's once supportive neighbors began to waver, swayed by the HOA's persistent messaging and the mounting legal pressure. Some even started to avoid him, fearful of being caught in the crossfire of the ongoing battle. Feeling increasingly isolated and outmatched, Ethan knew he needed to find a way to turn the tide back in his favor. That's when he remembered the other piece of evidence he had uncovered: Simmons' connection to a local waste management company that had been awarded a lucrative contract with the HOA. Digging deeper, Ethan discovered that the company's CEO was a close personal friend of Simmons, and that the contract had been awarded without any competitive bidding process. It was a clear conflict of interest, and Ethan was certain it would be the key to unraveling the HOA's web of corruption. Determined to expose this new revelation, Ethan reached out to the local news media once again. This time, they were more receptive, intrigued by the possibility of a major corruption scandal within the community. As the news story began to gain traction, the HOA's legal team went into overdrive, threatening the news station with a barrage of lawsuits if they dared to air the segment. But the journalists stood their ground, confident in the strength of Ethan's evidence. On the day the news report was set to air, tension in the community reached a fever pitch. Ethan watched anxiously as the segment unfolded, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. If this didn't work, he might have finally reached the end of his rope. As the report concluded, Ethan couldn't help but smile. The evidence was damning, and the HOA's corruption had been laid bare for the entire community to see. Now, the real battle would begin, a fight to hold Simmons and the HOA accountable for their misdeeds. The fallout from the news report was swift and intense. Within hours, the HOA's social media pages were flooded with outraged comments from residents demanding the resignation of Simmons and his entire board. Simmons, realizing that his position was now in jeopardy, lashed out in desperation. He called an emergency HOA meeting where he attempted to paint Ethan as a vindictive troublemaker who was trying to destroy the community. But this time, the residents were having none of it. One by one, they stood up and shared their own experiences with the HOA's heavy-handed tactics and questionable financial practices. The meeting quickly descended into chaos, with Simmons and his allies shouting futilely in a desperate attempt to maintain control. Ethan watched the proceedings with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. He had succeeded in exposing the truth, but he knew that the fight was far from over. The HOA had deep pockets and a well-oiled legal machine, and they were unlikely to go down without a fight. As the meeting drew to a close, Simmons made a final, impassioned plea. "This community is my life's work," he cried, his face flushed with anger. "I won't let some vindictive outsider tear it all down." But the residents were unmoved. One by one, they stood up and demanded Simmons' resignation, refusing to back down until he agreed to step down from his position. Sensing that he had lost the battle, Simmons stormed out of the meeting, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. His persistence had paid off, and the HOA's corrupt reign was finally coming to an end. But as the residents began to congratulate him and discuss the next steps, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The HOA had deep pockets and a tenacious legal team, and they were unlikely to go down without a fight. Ethan knew that he would need to remain vigilant, and that the battle for his community's future was far from over. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He had taken the first step towards restoring justice and accountability to his neighborhood. In the aftermath of the tumultuous HOA meeting, Ethan found himself in the unexpected position of community leader. Residents who had once been wary of his crusade against the HOA now rallied behind him, eager to see the corruption finally rooted out. Together, they formed a grassroots organization, determined to hold the HOA accountable and implement sweeping reforms. Ethan, despite his initial reluctance, agreed to serve as the group's spokesperson, using his newfound platform to continue exposing the HOA's misdeeds. The HOA, meanwhile, was in disarray. Simmons had resigned in disgrace, and the remaining board members were scrambling to regain control of the situation. They attempted to stall the reforms and bury the ongoing investigations, but Ethan and his allies refused to back down. As the legal battles raged on, the community's attention turned to the upcoming HOA elections. Ethan and his team worked tirelessly to rally support, mobilizing residents to vote for a slate of candidates who had pledged to clean up the organization. The election day arrived, and the tension in the air was palpable. Ethan watched anxiously as the results trickled in, his heart racing with every passing minute. When the final numbers were tallied, the outcome was clear. Ethan's slate had won a decisive victory, securing a majority on the HOA board. The triumph was bittersweet for Ethan. He had achieved what he had set out to do, but the cost had been high. The legal battles had drained his savings, and the constant stress had taken a toll on his personal life. But as he stood before the cheering crowd of residents, he knew that it had all been worth it. "This is just the beginning," Ethan exclaimed, his voice ringing with conviction. "We've taken the first step towards restoring justice and accountability to our community, but the fight is far from over. We will continue to root out corruption, hold the HOA accountable, and ensure that the interests of all residents are protected." The crowd erupted in applause, and Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had risked everything to expose the truth, and now he was ready to dedicate himself fully to the task of rebuilding the HOA from the ground up. As he left the election night celebration, Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of cautious optimism. The road ahead would be long and arduous, but he was more determined than ever to see his mission through. In the weeks that followed the HOA election, Ethan and his newly elected board members wasted no time in implementing sweeping reforms. They began by conducting a comprehensive audit of the organization's finances, leaving no stone unturned in their search for evidence of misappropriation or fraud. The findings were damning. Ethan and his team uncovered a complex web of kickbacks, inflated contracts, and outright embezzlement, all orchestrated by Simmons and his inner circle. They immediately moved to terminate the corrupt waste management contract, recouping millions of dollars that had been siphoned from the community's coffers. With the financial house in order, Ethan and his allies turned their attention to the HOA's governance. They overhauled the organization's bylaws, implementing robust transparency measures and establishing clear ethical guidelines for board members. Gone were the days of backroom deals and unchecked power. The new HOA would be accountable to the residents it served. But the road to reform was not without its challenges. Simmons and his loyal followers refused to go down without a fight, launching a barrage of lawsuits and smear campaigns aimed at discrediting Ethan and his team. The legal battles were relentless, draining the community's resources and testing the resolve of even the most committed activists. Through it all, Ethan remained steadfast, inspiring the residents to stand firm in the face of adversity. He knew that the fight was far from over, but he was determined to see it through to the end, no matter the personal cost. As the months passed, the community began to see the tangible benefits of the reforms. Fines were reduced, common areas were better maintained, and a sense of trust and collaboration began to emerge between the HOA and the residents. Ethan's once solitary crusade had transformed into a collective movement, with neighbors standing united in their pursuit of a better, more equitable community. But just when it seemed that the tide had finally turned, Ethan received a startling revelation. Simmons and his allies had been scheming behind the scenes, quietly amassing support among the more conservative residents. They were gearing up for a counterattack, determined to regain control of the HOA and undo all of the progress that had been made. Ethan knew that the final showdown was looming, and he braced himself for the fight of his life. As the HOA elections approached, Ethan and his team found themselves in a pitched battle for the very soul of their community. Simmons and his supporters had launched an aggressive campaign, using fear-mongering tactics and playing on the fears of residents who were wary of the changes that had been implemented. Ethan knew that the stakes had never been higher. If Simmons and his allies regained control of the HOA, all of their hard-won reforms would be in jeopardy, and the community would be right back where it started, under the oppressive rule of a corrupt and self-serving organization. Undaunted, Ethan and his team redoubled their efforts, engaging in a tireless outreach campaign to educate residents on the importance of their vote. They held town halls, organized neighborhood canvassing, and leveraged social media to amplify their message of transparency, accountability, and community-focused governance. As Election Day approached, the tension in the air was palpable. Ethan could feel the weight of the community's hopes resting squarely on his shoulders, and he knew that failure was not an option. When the final votes were tallied, Ethan let out a sigh of relief. His slate had emerged victorious, securing an even stronger mandate from the residents. Simmons and his supporters had been soundly defeated, their dreams of regaining power dashed. In the aftermath of the election, Ethan stood before the cheering crowd of residents, his eyes brimming with pride and gratitude. "We did it," he exclaimed, his voice ringing with triumph. "We've taken back our community, and we've shown that when we stand together, we can overcome even the most entrenched corruption." The crowd erupted in applause, and Ethan knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long and arduous, but he was more determined than ever to see his vision for a better, more equitable community come to fruition. As he left the victory celebration, Ethan couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him to this moment. It had been a grueling and often thankless fight, but in the end, his unwavering commitment to the truth and his refusal to back down had paid off. Ethan knew that the work was far from over, but he felt a renewed sense of purpose and optimism. The community had come together, united in their desire for change, and he was confident that they would continue to stand strong in the face of any challenge that came their way. With a determined smile, Ethan turned his gaze towards the future, ready to tackle the next chapter in the ongoing battle for the soul of his neighborhood.